Hi, my name is Sean McDonald, and I am a member of Crab Team. I'm coming to you from the shores of beautiful Hood Canal, Washington. It's my job today to tell you a little bit about the pocket estuary diversity that you may encounter doing Crab Team early detection and monitoring work for European green crab. This is one of a series of tutorials aimed at getting you familiar with the types of organisms that you might encounter doing trapping and molt surveys with this program. So what sorts of critters might you encounter doing trap or molt surveys? The interesting thing about pocket estuaries is they're incredibly diverse. Pocket estuaries are nursery grounds and they're foraging areas for a wide variety of different types of animals. And because estuaries in general are a place where rivers meet the sea, you have a really interesting and dynamic system where different organisms are coming and going, and so we have a lot of diversity and a lot of really interesting things happening. And this can occur. This can bring in juveniles of different species. It can bring in adults, and so you have to be familiar with these various critters so that when they show up in our surveys, you'll be able to identify them. In this particular episode, I'll be talking about the crabs. Crabs are by far the most common critters that we see in our sampling efforts. In other modules, I'll be talking about shrimp and other invertebrates, and I'll also be talking about fishes, so stay tuned for those as well. In this episode, though, I will be talking about crabs. Before I begin, I want to talk a little bit about color. You've probably noticed that our program targets European green crab. You may have heard of red rock crab. You may have even heard about yellow shore crabs. All of these common names reference color, which is sort of unfortunate because color is actually not a very good way to identify crabs. First of all, color is extremely variable in crabs. So you might come across a yellow shore crab that is green. You might come across a European green crab, which is orange. So these colors are probably not the best way to identify critters. Also, if you're looking at molts of crabs on the shore, you'll see that a molt that's been sitting out in the sun for an extended period of time will be bleached out and might actually even be white. And so again, color is not a great attribute to use for identification purposes. Well, if you can't use color, what can you use? Well, morphology or anatomy is probably a much better approach for identifying crabs. So let's get familiar with the anatomy of a crab. This is a very stereotypical crab here. First thing I should mention is that crabs are bilaterally symmetrical, meaning that the right side and left side of the crab are identical. You could draw a line smack dab through the middle of the crab and you'll see that they are nearly identical left and right. And that's kind of important to consider as we talk about identification. When I talk about the various features, I'll just be referring to one side of the crab, and you'll see that that's mirrored on the other. So let's talk about some of the key features for identification. First of all, the back shell of the crab is called the carapace. Along the leading edge of the carapace, you might see marginal teeth. These are points and protuberances that project off that leading edge of the carapace adjacent to the eye orbit. Between the eyes, you'll see the rostrum, which is what we call the nose spine. And as I said, the eye orbit, that's essentially the crescent shape where the eye, from which the eye projects. And that can be an important landmark to look for. There are the walking legs, of which typically crabs have between 3 and 4 walking legs. And then there's the claw or cheliped, which is a modified leg, but they use it to grasp food, mates, and to climb. So those are the basic features of the anatomy of a crab that we'll use for identification purposes. Now, I typically use a mnemonic to help me think about the proper way to identify crabs. I like this mnemonic because in some ways it gives you a hierarchical order of features to look for when you're doing identification. The mnemonic is clever crabs will conquer. And clever crabs will conquer translates roughly into carapace, claws, walking legs, and then color. And if you use that sort of ranked order of attributes or features, you should be able to identify just about any crab you encounter in one of our pocket estuaries. So first of all, what is the shape of the carapace? How many marginal teeth, and what is the shape of those marginal teeth? Between the eyes, are there bumps to the rostrum? Moving on to the claws, what's the shape, size of the claws? What about the dentition, so the teeth on the claw itself? How about those walking legs? What's the shape of those legs, the size of the legs relative to the body? Or do they have hairs? Those are all features you'll look for. And then finally, color. And as I said, color is not a great primary attribute to look for, but it can be somewhat useful when used in combination with carapace, claws, and walking legs. Well, the first critter I want to talk about is the European green crab, Carcinus manus. Not because it's the most common crab you'll see, but because it is the target of our sampling effort. I want to make sure that you're familiar with the sort of standard approach that we use. First of all, the common name European green crab, the scientific name Carcinus manus, and then the code that we use in our sampling. The code, CAMA or CAMA, is the first two letters of the genus and the first two letters of the species name. So CAMA, Carcinus manus. Now, we'll go through sort of the basic features to help you identify a European green crab. First things first, we look at the carapace. And that's really actually the easiest way to identify a European green crab from any native crab you might encounter in our area. The European green crab has a very unique carapace. There are 5 marginal teeth that extend out from the eye, and there are 3 bumps to the rostrum between the eyes. And with those 2 features of the carapace, you can differentiate a European green crab from any other crab out there. Now, why don't you want to use color? Well, because color is highly variable. This larger image shows molts of European green crab, and you can see that the molts range in color from green, olive to rusty red and orange. And as juveniles, green crab can actually occur in a whole variety of different color patterns, including sort of a mottled or marbled color that helps them blend in with shell. That's what you're seeing in this smaller inset photo. So color is not extremely useful, but by looking at the shape of the carapace alone, you should be able to identify a European green crab from any other sort of crab that you would encounter in our sampling effort. Now, recall that European green crab don't get that big, maybe about 4 inches across the carapace, or about as big as the size of your fist. And if you look at those attributes of the carapace, you should be able to identify them. Moving on, let's talk about some of our native shore crabs. By far, the most abundant of our native shore crabs is the hairy shore crab, Hemigrapsis organensis, or HEOR. If we were doing this tutorial in person, I would have a tray, as is illustrated here, that would show you the different molts of these various crabs. I should also mention that in our identification guide, if you have one in front of you, you'll see a little star and a little triangle. Those stars and the star and triangle gives you an indication of how abundant we expect these species to be in either our trapping surveys or our molt surveys. And the fact that you see both a yellow star and a yellow triangle indicates that this is by far the most abundant species that we encounter in both our molt surveys and our trapping surveys. So how do you identify them? Well, first of all, they're not very large, but they can be easily distinguished from European green crab because they have 3 forward-facing marginal teeth and 2 visible rostral bumps. They also have exceptionally hairy walking legs. And those walking legs will be important later on, trust me. So these are the features that we use to differentiate the hairy short crab from others. So here's a close-up. You can see those 3 spines to the marginal teeth. You see the 2 pronounced rostral bumps, and you see the hairy walking legs. Now these features are important. One, because they'll help you identify the hairy short crab from European green crab, but they'll also, more importantly, help you identify the hairy short crab from their native cousin, the purple short crab. The purple short crab's scientific name is Hemigrapsis nudus. Its code is HENU. Now, they look superficially very similar to their cousin, but their marginal teeth face slightly inward, and they have 2 rostral bumps that are fairly indistinguishable. But most importantly, as the species name indicates, they have nude legs. They have hairless legs. That's a really important feature to help you identify a live purple short crab from a live hairy short crab. Here's that purple short crab in close-up. You see the 3 marginal teeth outside the eye, but you notice that these are curved inward. You see that the rostral bumps look almost as if they've been sanded off. It's fairly flat, sort of indistinguishable. And most importantly, there are no hairs on the walking legs. So side by side, we have a hairy short crab and we have a purple short crab. I've mentioned that they both have 3 marginal teeth. They occupy similar habitats, and they are actually similar in size. So there's a lot of overlap, but we can tell them apart. First and foremost, we can look at those walking legs. If the walking legs are hairy, then it's a hairy short crab. If there are no hairs, then it's a purple short crab. Also, the shape and orientation of those marginal teeth are very important. And again, color and spots on the carapace are fairly variable, so we tend not to use those when we are identifying these crabs. And here's just to give you an indication of color variation. On the left, you see the color variation among Hemigrapsis organensis on one island in the Salish Sea. So these are all crabs that were found on San Juan Island in the Salish Sea. So incredible color variation among live crabs. On the right, you see molts of a purple short crab. And as the molts age, you see that the color actually deteriorates quite a bit. And so again, color is extremely variable, and we tend not to use it as a diagnostic feature when we can use these other features instead. Now, it's very common that you may encounter just the carapace when you're doing your molt surveys. In this case, you may not have the legs to look at. In which case, if you don't have the legs to look at, you just need to be able to identify it based on the shape of the carapace. In this case, the yellow or hairy short crab on the left, the purple short crab on the right. One of the things that my daughter really enjoys is the idea of putting laser beams on the crab, because why not? Now, if you were to take laser beams, or lasers rather, and you were to orient them in the direction of those carapace teeth, you would see that the lasers would be more or less parallel. And so laser beams projecting from those lasers would be parallel. Now, if you did the same thing on the purple short crab, you would see that projecting forward, those laser beams would intersect. Again, moving backwards, You see on this carapace, rostral bumps pronounced on the hairy short crab, not pronounced on the purple short crab. But if you were to take the lasers and place them on the carapace in the orientation of those marginal teeth, the hairy short crab, they would be parallel. The purple short crab, they would cross. Now that may not be that helpful to you, but I'll tell you what, kids love this idea. So take it for what you will. Now, as I mentioned, color is not a great way to identify crabs. This is just to drive that point home one more time. On the left, you see two crabs, and they're both greenish in color, but you'll notice that the crab on top has hairy legs, the one down below does not. And in fact, this is a hairy short crab and a purple short crab of the same color morph. Right hand image here is actually a hairy short crab that is purple in coloration. So again, color is not very useful for identifying these crab species. All right, so now a test for you. I'm showing you 3 images of a short crab. This is a single crab. 3 different images. I've just shown you how to identify 3 different types of short crab. The invasive European short crab, the native hairy short crab, and the native purple short crab. Using what I've just told you, can you identify this crab? Remember to use the mnemonic, starting with the carapace, then moving on to the claws and the walking legs, and then finally thinking about color. Well, we can count the number of marginal teeth. It only has 3 marginal teeth, so we can exclude European green crab. So it's one of our native short crabs. Does it have hairy walking legs? No, it does not. So this is a Hemigrapsis nudus, or the purple short crab, in a green form. I hope that that was clear to you from the description I gave. If not, please review the video and try again. All right, so we've talked about the short crabs. Now let's move on and talk about some of the other crabs that you might encounter. Most of you would be familiar with the Dungeness crab because they're delicious. You may have eaten them in restaurants, or if you've been lucky enough to go out in the Salish Sea, you've been able to trap them yourself. They are fantastic to eat, and they're really important ecologically and economically for our region. Most of you, though, would probably have encountered adult Dungeness crab. In estuaries, like pocket estuaries, it's more likely that you will find juvenile Dungeness crab. These probably won't be any larger than your fist. We do periodically get them in our baited traps, and we certainly find their molts in our molt surveys. The scientific name, Metacarcinus magister. The code is MEMA, MEMA. They have an oval carapace, and they're whitest at the 10th carapace tooth, or marginal tooth. Here it is in close-up. You can count up those marginal teeth outside the eye orbit, and you'll see that there are 10 teeth, and it is whitest at the 10th tooth. They have hairy walking legs, and they also have very interesting claws. The claws in this case have serrations along the upper margin, and that's kind of important as we move forward to differentiate it from another native crab. In fact, its closest relative in our waters is the graceful crab, Metacarcinus gracilis. Many of us have never seen a graceful crab, or if we have seen a graceful crab, we may have mistaken it for a Dungeness crab. They look very, very similar, and to the untrained eye, they may look almost identical. But We can use the mnemonic CCWC to help us differentiate it from the Dungeness crab. In this case, they also have an oval carapace, but they're whitest at the 9th tooth. The 10th tooth actually appears as a notch. Here it is up close. We see those carapace teeth. Again, the marginal teeth, it's whitest at the 9th tooth. The 10th tooth is a recessed notch. If we look at the claws, we'll see that the upper surface of the claw does not have serrations. If we look at the walking legs, we see that they don't have hairs, and in fact they tend to be longer and more slender, which gives the crab its name, graceful crab. And finally, if we were to look at color, side by side, a graceful crab tends to be a little bit more colorful, tends to be more purple. Although, again, we don't use color as a primary diagnostic characteristic. So how do we distinguish these two crabs side by side? If you're looking at two juvenile crabs, a graceful crab and a Dungeness crab, they look very, very similar, but by carefully examining the carapace, we'll see that the graceful crab is whitest at the 9th tooth, and the Dungeness crab is whitest at the 10th tooth. That's the easiest way to tell these two species apart. Now, I mentioned that Dungeness crab and graceful crab are close cousins. Well, the red rock crab is a distant cousin. The red rock crab scientific name is Cancer productus, or CAPR is the code. Now, we see these species less frequently, but it does occur, and so it's important to be able to identify it. In this case, there is an oval carapace, but it has blunt marginal teeth. An interesting feature of the claws, although they're very, very large, they also have black tips. Now, I know color is not a great diagnostic characteristic in general, but in this case, the black tips are very, very important because the pigmentation, the melanin in the tip of the claw actually strengthens the claw tip, which is extremely important because these crabs have extremely powerful claws meant for crushing shells. So looking at it up close, we see the wide, blunt, marginal teeth. We see the black claws. Another interesting feature that I like to point out is that the rostrum has a slightly different shape than its other relatives. It has what looks almost like the bill or brim of a cap because it has 5 marginal teeth that sort of project forward of the eye orbits. That's actually much more pronounced in the juvenile rock crabs. So these are all Cancer productus juveniles. You see a lot of color variation, but you also see that rostrum projects far forward and almost looks like the bill of a cap. And as I said, color is extremely variable, especially in the juveniles. The adults tend to be uniformly red, but the juveniles can be amazingly colorful. One of my favorites is the all white, as well as the zebra stripe here. All right, so now I've shown you some of the cancrid crabs, the Dungeness crab, the graceful crab, and the red rock crab. It is important to be able to differentiate these, and I think that now you have the tools to do that. The last crabs that I want to show you are a little bit different. They are sometimes confused. They oftentimes are mistaken for something strange and exotic because we don't tend to see these as often in baited traps, but they are very common in our region and can be found in pocket estuaries. The first is Telmesis. Its code is TECH. This is the hairy helmet crab. It is unique in its shape in that it is diamond shaped in the carapace. It's also covered with small or fine bristles. Its claws are extremely small compared with its long walking legs. And in fact, This is one of the fastest crabs we have in our region. Looking at it up close, you'll see those fine hairs covering the entire body. And then oftentimes when you see these crabs alive, they'll look very dirty. It's because those fine hairs collect debris and sand, which helps them camouflage against their environment. But even as a molt, you'll feel the bristles on the carapace and the rest of the body. It will help you identify it. Another type of crab, which is frequently mistaken for the hairy helmet crab, are spider crabs. This is a very large family that is very abundant and diverse in our region. So this includes the sheep crabs from California, the kelp crabs from our region, all the way up to the tanner and snow crabs in the Bering Sea that many of us love to eat. These crabs are interesting because they have a carapace that is typically longer front to back than they are wide. They have a very pronounced rostrum that extends out between the eyes, and they have long spidery legs. The family uses the code SPID for spider. And as I said, they're very abundant and very diverse in our region. Here are just two examples. The graceful kelp crab, which is almost a type of decorator that allows it to collect debris for camouflage. And then the northern kelp crab, which we oftentimes find in our kelp forests. And as I said, longer front to back than wide in terms of the carapace, very pronounced rostrum, and extremely long legs. And here's just a bit of the diversity in the carapace shape of the spider crabs. We don't ask you to go into any more detail. If you see a spider crab, we just lump all of those into a single category. But if you want to identify it further, you can always snap a picture and we can help you do that. But again, wider front to back, or I should say longer front to back than it is wide. And as I said, very diverse in terms of morphology. So looking at the two carapaces side by side, these are very common, what you might see in your molt survey. Although both of these carapaces have many spines and carapace teeth, you'll notice that the hairy helmet crab has a rough, bristled appearance, whereas the spider crab is smooth, and those rostral spines stick out extremely far on the spider crab. All right, so I've gone through and shown you all of the true crabs, and I'm not going to get into too many of the details about what separates the true crabs from the false crabs, but suffice it to say that the last two that I'm going to show you now are the hermit crabs, which is a slightly different type of crab. They, when you look at a hermit crab, you may only see 2 or possibly 3 pairs of walking legs and the claws. Probably the most common type of hermit crab we might see in a pocket estuary is Pagarus hirsutiscus, or the hairy hermit crab. It tends to occupy a very tiny shell that it collects from either some type of snail, typically. And they have extremely long and hairy legs. And in fact, if you pick one of these hermit crabs up, they may crawl out of their shell entirely and run off. Just one of the other points that I would like to make is that they tend to have both banded antennae and bands on the walking legs. Now that contrasts with the grainy hermit crab, or Pagarus granisomanus. Granisomanus means grainy hand. Its code is PAGR. It doesn't have those bands on the antenna or the walking legs. And if you look at the claws very closely, you'll see that it has blue tubercles, or dots, spots, and spines. Now, unlike the hairy hermit crab, the grainy hermit crab tends to occupy a very large shell that it can retract fully into. which makes it sort of interesting and unique compared to the hairy hermit crab. So looking at these two side by side, what we see is that the hairy hermit crab, it has white banded hairy legs. The grainy-handed hermit has blue tubercles on those legs and claws. The hairy hermit crab occupies a shell which is often too big for its shell, whereas the grainy-handed hermit is oftentimes too small for its shell. That oftentimes can help you identify these two hermit crabs. Now, less commonly, we see other types of crabs either as molts or sometimes occasionally within our baited traps. And if you look at our identification guides, you may see these. I'm not going to go into any detail during this tutorial because we very infrequently see these species, but this includes the black-clawed crab, the pygmy rock crab, pea crabs, and porcelain crabs. If at any time you encounter a crab that you cannot identify, please just take some pictures. If it's a molt, you can keep that molt and contact us, and we can help you identify them. If you are going to take photos in the field, please try to get pictures from multiple angles. Try to get pictures of the carapace, the claws, the walking legs, and of course make sure that you have a good color for the photos as well. That can be helpful in identification. Well, this concludes this particular tutorial on pocket estuary diversity, in this case the crabs. Please see some of our other tutorials to learn about other crustaceans as well as some of the other invertebrates and fishes that you may encounter doing the crab team pocket estuary early detection and monitoring work. Thank you very much. Have a great day.